All right, well, as I always say, welcome sport fans, welcome to our nonpartisan and on the record Global Connections Info Public Policy Roundtable. Wherever IFE is, civility and collaboration prevail. Now in its 22nd season, IFE has been recognizing and promoting civility, collaboration, and common ground locally, nationally, and in our world community. Mayor Williams, right over here, it's fitting that you are hosting us this morning, and thank you. Mayor Williams was at the helm of our capital city when 9/11 struck. Your stewardship for the Institute for Education, Mayor Williams, over 15 years has been extraordinary, and we thank you. And welcome, of course, to our totally high-powered panel, Ambassador Kislyak and General Hayden, our IFE veterans, and John Negroponte. It's great to have you with us here. You three gentlemen join a very distinguished list of past info speakers, including Nobel laureates, cabinet secretaries, a vice president, a White House chief of staff, the director of the CIA and FBI, governors, mayors, senators, a Miss America, a professional athlete, and 5 Supreme Court justices. There is no doubt IFE Info is a game-changing Washington institution. And I want to welcome our amazing IFE diplomatic steward, Jan Meitesen from the Kingdom of Belgium. Thank you so much for your leadership, Ambassador. And all of our ambassadors that are with us, our extraordinary and plenipotentiary, thank you for coming. One special word to the Norwegians, my great friends, Vegard and the Reverend Dr. Cecile. This will be their last Info Public Policy Roundtable. They get super high marks for participation in all things IFE. I don't think you've missed one IFE forum when you've been in town. And your leadership and participation has just been an enormous effort and help to the Institute for Education. And our friendship, when my house burned down, they were there helping me take out all the wine and storing it and cataloging it. Vegard is a Chevalier de Testament, so he cataloged all of our fancy wine, and we have to get it out of the embassy, I guess, now, before you leave. And welcome, of course, to Marcy Robinson, who's today, this was her idea, putting together this panel, chairman of our Board of Stewards. Where's Marcy? There you go. Thanks, Marcy, for your great idea. And Ken White, our CFO. Where's Ken White? There. Thank you, Ken, for your leadership. Now, we always do a little bit of buzz before we get into the meat. Today, we have IFE fellow Ali Wine. Ali, there you are. Stand up. Ali has written a book, co-authored a book called Lee Kun Yew with Graham Allison and Robert Blackwell. And the foreword is by Henry Kissinger, not too shabby. There are books available for you, and I want to congratulate you, Ali. We're so proud of all your great work at the Institute for Education.
Thank you.
Now, we have an authentic Boston marathoner with us today, Ben Beach, who is my sister-in-law's sister's husband. Okay, Ben was running in his 46th consecutive Boston Marathon. 2 people have run 45 Boston Marathons consecutively, Ben being one. Because of the bombing, the tragedy, Ben was not able to complete his 46th Boston Marathon. So I thought it would be very appropriate today to give Ben a medal, the Institute for Education Athletic Achievement Award. We'll all be watching you, Ben, in 2014 to see you run your 40, well, what will they call it, your 47th?
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Now, I don't know, how many people here have run a marathon? So there's a few, okay. So you all have run a marathon. Now just think, 45 marathons. I mean, the guy's a little nuts to begin with.
Only a little, that's very generous.
But whatever, look at him, healthy and fit, you know, not an ounce of flab on him. Congratulations, Ben. We'll be looking out for you. Now you can all follow IFE on Twitter. Our hashtag is IFEinfo, and Facebook, and as Fried Zakaria says, and all that stuff for social media. And now the man that holds the record for speaking at the Institute for Education, 8 times he has spoken, and the man that brought Major League Baseball to our capital city. We'll introduce our panel, but before you do that, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to have you tell us that day, 9/11, where did you go to try to secure our city and get your residents to feel safe? Tell us what happened that day with you.
Well, first of all, welcome everyone to this iteration of IFE, and I want to personally welcome everyone here to the Federal City Council. The Federal City Council was started back in the 1950s by Phil Graham, father of Don Graham, publisher of the Washington Post, as a non-self-interested group of leading businesses in the city that would operate in the nexus between business, the local government, and the federal government to do, 1, projects that were barely achievable, 2, projects that had a big impact, 3, projects for which they were indispensable. And over the last 50 or so years, been involved in educational reform, been involved in the Metro, as you see it, the building of the Metro, the Verizon Center, Reagan Building, Pennsylvania Avenue revitalization, a number of marquee projects we're very proud of. And we're now leading the Federal City Council into the next century with a new suite of projects that we think are really going to make the Federal City Council a showcase for business leadership, showing how businesses in the public realm can help the public sector create what's actually most important, and that is public value for the people in our community. So just a little advertisement for the Federal City Council. And on 9/11, I was living over on Foggy Bottom, and I could see the Pentagon from 9/11. I was actually sick that day, so I was slow getting up. My wife came in, told me a plane had hit the World Trade Center like millions of people. I thought it was an errant plane until I turned on the TV, saw it was an airliner, was thinking, that's really unusual. I heard the commentator on NBC say, hold on just a second, and then I heard someone down the hall scream, because actually one of my neighbors down the hall actually saw the flight fly into the Pentagon. So I had to quickly race, get kind of together physically and psychologically. I have to tell you, it's just hard to psychologically put yourself together and try to do anything, let alone lead a city. And then went over to the Emergency Command Center, where I did everything from try to pull the city together organizationally and logistically in conjunction with the federal government. I played host to a number of dignitaries who were stranded in the city, and they took kind of like refuge or safe haven in the command center, and bode our time. And I would say over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, psychologically got ready for the role. Initially, to be honest with you, and I can say this now that I'm out of office, the first couple of days I didn't think I did a very good job at all. I'll put it this way. From the very beginning, I think I did as good a job as anyone could do organizationally to pull the city together. But psychologically, to lead the city emotionally, it took about 4 or 5 days for me to realize that that was important, to get over the fact that, well, I'm not good at kind of schmoozing with people and leading people in that way. You know, part of leading is you have to sometimes act out of character. You know, get over it, don't make excuses, stand up and lead. And I think through the end of 9/11 and into the anthrax attack, I began doing that. But it was a learning process. It'd be a learning process for everyone. Traumatic. And it stays with us to this day. I'll give you a story just on the subway today. I'm riding on the subway. A lady gets on, Islamic dress. You know, no one wants to stereotype, but she's carrying a huge bag. She puts the bag down. She starts wandering all over the subway car, muttering about something or another happening in Nigeria. And she's screaming. And she's saying, I'm not going to stand near my bag. I'm not going to sit near my bag. And I said, well, you don't have to stand or sit anywhere, but could you please shut up? I mean, it's early in the morning. I haven't had my coffee yet. She keeps screaming, wandering around. And finally I said, lady, I want to be respectful, but you have to understand, you need to sit or stand or do whatever you're doing near your bag. Okay, we're not playing. I said this out loud. Everybody in the subway was like, whoa. Once a mayor, always a mayor. I said, you need to stand by your bag, okay? This is serious business. Now, you can say whatever you want, but you need to get by that bag or I'm going to report you to the authorities. Oh, okay. But she went and stood by her bag, still muttering, but it's serious. Everybody's going to take a responsibility now. That's one of the lessons we've learned. Everybody, regardless of your station or your position in life, has got to take a role in providing the kind of vigilance that you need, particularly in a free society.
Good, thank you. So now, introduce our panel.
So now let me introduce our panel. You already heard from the ambassador, from Ambassador Negroponte, and from General Hayden. I want to say, Ambassador Kislyak, you should know that I have in my office, and I didn't do this just for you, I have the Charles Menard poster, the campaign of Napoleon and the horrific losses Napoleon suffered when he attacked Russia. It's a cautionary note for anyone thinking about doing something stupid and cavalier. And I have it in my office. As mayor, as mayor, I took a great interest in forming a good relationship with your country. They were very supportive of us in a number of different ways, and we particularly welcome you to provide insight today on the events in Boston and their association with the situation in Russia and Islamic factions, causes there. General Hayden, you should know, presented to me, I sat on a panel, you don't remember this, General, at the Kennedy School, where he presented for a great work he did in coordinating intelligence data and services, and presented to the Innovations in Government panel for an award on innovations in government. And indeed, the general has led the effort in trying to bring more harmony, reason, and rationale to the gamut of intelligence services and activities in our country. And I think he has, a great role to play here in not only the role of intelligence, but as someone who has served in the military and in the executive branch, how you actually put good policy principles and criteria into practice. So we welcome the general. And last but not least, also with a background in a series of different roles, we want to welcome, Ambassador Negroponte, who brings, I think, particular insight and analysis here as well, not only in a range of different fields in foreign policy, but having also served in a number of different roles in our government and having an insight in how all these issues play out at a local, at a federal, and at an international level. So we have a great panel here to talk about these issues. We're going to ask each of our panelists to share some thoughts with us for, 5 minutes, Coach?
5 minutes is good.
5 minutes, and then we want to really focus our attention on fostering and encouraging a discussion with our IFE members. So without further ado, why don't I start with General Hayden and ask him to share 5 or 6 minutes of remarks with us. And once again, let's give our panelists a big hand and welcome them to IFE.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Coach. I'll be very brief. We need to keep things in scale. And I've actually said publicly, so let me repeat it for this audience, that what happened in Boston was a tragedy, but it was not a catastrophe. And let me begin with that as kind of the homilectic, and then pivot off of that point. Because of what our government has done over 2 successive administrations under 2 very different presidents, but powerfully consistent policy against terrorism, we have forced our enemies into a course of action that they would never have opted for. The typical al-Qaeda sponsored, affiliated, or directed attack against the United States that wants to be against an iconic target. It wants to create mass casualties. It's World Trade Center 1, it's 9/11, it's Bojinka, which is an airliner plot over the Pacific, it's the 2006 wide-body jets coming out of Great Britain to North America plot as well. But when Boston happened, before we knew the inside story, you and I had trouble figuring out whether this was a high-end crime or a low-end terrorist attack. That's a measure of success. We have forced our enemies off of this plane, and now they're playing down here. And so I think Boston proves a premise that I think most folks like me believed in even before it happened. Future terrorist attacks against this country will be less complex, less well-organized, less likely to succeed, less lethal even if they do succeed. They're just going to be more numerous. And that's something we're just going to have to steel ourselves to. It's going to be a drive-by shooting in Little Rock. It's going to be Najib al-Azazi trying to go to the New York subways. It's going to be Faisal Shahzad in Times Square. It's going to be Major Hassan at Fort Hood. It's going to be those kinds of attacks. And now the question you have to ask yourself as citizens, and if I were still in government, the guidance I would be wanting from my policy masters, who are obviously shaped and formed by your views, is what do you want me to do? How much more do you want me to try to do to prevent those kinds of attacks, knowing full well that we've already squeezed American privacy, American commerce, American convenience? Put another way, how much do you want to take off at DCA? Okay? How much do you want to take off at IAD when you go through the lines? My personal view is we're just about okay. I don't know that I can promise you any more dramatic returns for doing more to make this kind of attack less likely. Now, the handshake we have to all agree on, though, is that we all recognize that in order to preserve our way of life, in order to preserve our DNA as a free people, we're all going to agree that sooner or later something down here is going to happen. And when it does, you know, we'll probably combine the British approach to this and the American approach, which is the British is keep calm and carry on, and the American is, but if you see something, say something as we go forward. Let me offer you one more thought, which is a little counter message to what it is I've said to you already. But you want us to be provocative and put chum in the water for the question and answer period, so here you go. If these two mopes were living in New York, this attack would not have happened. Now I'm looking at Kim over here, and Associated Press won a Pulitzer Prize for their stories on what the New York Police Department does.
Not me.
I know, it wasn't you, it was Matt and his compatriots. The New York Police Department is far more aggressive, far more invasive, doing what's been termed mosque crawling and a whole bunch of other things to permeate the Islamic American community. Boston doesn't do that. The probability that these two young, particularly the one, the older one, Tamerlane's behavior shows up on the scope in New York is much higher than it was in Boston. Now the question is, what happened in New York is very controversial. What the New York Police Department does under Ray Kelly is causing grand debates inside this country. So do you see what the issue is? The issue is we've taken the big attacks off the table, and now we're down here. And the grand discussion we need to have as a people is there anything more we should or ought to be doing to make those attacks less likely? And the answer may very well be, not much. Thank
That
you.
was great, General. Thank you. And now, Ambassador Kislyak.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much for your welcome words and for right signs to be displayed in your office. And thank you, Coach, for having invited me. I think the subject matter is so important to the Americans, it's important to us as well. It's a tragedy in Boston that we all certainly felt pain over, because most probably not many countries are in the world that know the pain of terrorist attacks as my country does. That's why it resonated with all the Russians, and emotions and the sense of sympathy with Americans was absolutely genuine, massive, and I think very warranted. But this event is certainly a stark reminder of the need to increase cooperation in fighting terrorism. It's something that almost has become a kind of platitude that everybody needs to cooperate. But the question is, do we cooperate well enough? Do we cooperate intentionally enough? And I think that it's just a reminder also that the terrorism has ideological, sometimes more sophisticated ties that transcend borders. And if you are serious about dealing with it, you need to work on multilateral basis and to work wherever you have a chance to deal and to deny the potential terrorist chance to succeed. Here, I think the special services need to work even more, and we are very encouraged by the cooperation that is expanding between our two countries on this issue, these issues rather, because it's a multi-faced a problem. We also sometimes cooperate on these issues in a way that not many countries pay attention to, for example, not people pay attention to. And sometimes this cooperation doesn't call for public discussions, which is certainly natural. But at the same time, a lot of things that both countries and others can do together is very important. And one has to analyze what is the phenomenon of the current terrorism, because it's not only Muslim terrorism, and those terrorists, they simply hijack the Muslim religion for the political purposes. But there are other forms of terrorism as well, and what happened in Norway, I think, is also a reminder that the crazy people are not only limited to this part of the world, but we certainly see that these regions of the Muslim world are going through a big transformation, and in that kind of environment, all the extremists usually try to take over. In my country, we are also facing a lot of problems of similar kind, and even after Boston events here, that caused so much of attention, and naturally it is a reason for very big attention, not only of Americans but other people. But we also afterwards had a number of terrorist attacks in Russia, which are not widely reported here. But people are also killed, and in big numbers than here in Boston, and this kind of process is continuing. And what we see more and more youngsters that are being involved. The very recent case in Russia is a 24 years widow, the so-called widow, of a former terrorist, exploded herself in a car, killing a number of policemen. It's also another form of the terrorism, and the terrorism also mimicry. I'm not a specialist to tell whether the big forms of terrorism are going to continue or they will be limited to small ones. I have no knowledge of all that kind of tendencies, but we see that this expression of hatred, inter-ethnic intolerance, sectarian violence is something that has become more and more omnipresent, I would say, in the world. And among the other things, there are factors that certainly is a kind of fertile ground for the youngsters to be involved in that kind of activities. That is certainly economic situation that leaves a lot of them in the streets without work. It's certainly the propaganda that is massively thrown on them by fundamentalists and extremists. And those people, they do not hesitate to use the means, the modern means of communications, internet and everything else that is available in a very aggressive way. Also, the modern communications, modern freedom of transportation, freedom of travel, that also gives chances for these people to interact in different countries. And I would like to underline what I started with. It's a phenomenon that is like a cancerous disease, expanding, and you wouldn't be successful fighting only in one country. It has to be fought by cooperating on a global basis, and I think we all, the governments that are involved with all these issues, need to do significantly more in analyzing, cooperating, and interacting in practical sense. I just would add to this that we have just had a recent visit by the Minister of Interior in Russia that has somewhat different portfolio than your Minister of Interior. It's more law enforcement. And we were encouraged, and he was encouraged by the way he was discussing it with Homeland Security and other agencies in the United States. And on both sides, people are willing to increase cooperation, to exchange more of information in proactive fashion. And that's certainly a healthy process that needs to be encouraged and spread maybe also in future among other countries. So once again, what I wanted to say, the Boston is a stark reminder of the difficulties and horrors that the mankind is still facing, and it's not going to be wished away. And in order to fight it, we have to do it on the basis of cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And last but certainly not least, Ambassador Negroponte.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and thank you, Coach Kemper, for bringing us together today. And I greet my colleagues, both of whom I've had a chance to work with over the years, particularly Mike Hayden, who was my deputy when we first set up the Office of the Directorate of National Intelligence. And I think it's fair to say that I could definitely not have done that without Mike's background, experience, and energy. So delighted to be here with the both of you. And Sergey, you and I have had a number of interesting times in the past negotiating various communiques when we were both deputy foreign ministers, so to speak. Mike Hayden mentioned the Bojinka affair, which was the interception of this plot to kill the Pope and blow up some airliners over the Pacific. Well, Ambassador Kislyak of the Philippines is here, and I'd like to point out that that plot was disrupted in the Philippines in January of 1995. I happened to have been ambassador there at the time, and I don't think we had any idea then that this was basically the precursor to the whole Al-Qaeda movement and bin Laden and so forth. And in fact, bin Laden had been active in the Philippines, supporting some of the extremist activities down in Mindanao. So this whole situation has a fairly long history. I think the analogy to cancer, in a way, was kind of interesting by Ambassador Kislyak, because what has happened is a form of metastasis. These are smaller cancers, but they've spread more widely. And so I guess the one question we have to ask ourselves is whether a large attack is still possible, and is there somebody cooking up another 9/11 somewhere that we don't know about? I think we tend to assume that we've got things a lot better covered than we used to have them, both here and elsewhere in the world. Certainly, we've all geared up for this kind of counterterrorism activity and law enforcement strengthening and paramilitary and so forth. But is it conceivable that another event such as of the magnitude of 9/11 could occur? And I think while the chances have perhaps diminished substantially, you can't ever completely rule that out. But clearly, what we face from day to day is the kind of incidents we're talking about here. What interested me when we discovered that the Boston events had a link back to Russia was that immediately to my mind, it came to my mind that this is an opportunity for us to strengthen and enhance our cooperation with Russia on these matters, as well as many others. But I'm glad that that seems to have been the general public reaction here in the United States. You could have had a different reaction. You could have had a reaction, oh my God, this has its roots in Russia. What are we going to do to penalize the relationship somehow? But that is not the the course that the administration and our public seems to have taken. And in fact, if anything, and perhaps because of so many other things in the foreign policy agenda going on at the moment that require cooperation between our two countries, in fact, we see a strengthening of U.S.-Russian cooperation. And I think this is all to the good because it's not only terrorism, it's Syria, it's nuclear proliferation, it's Iran, it's North Korea. There are many, many different issues on which we have to work, and I'm just glad to see that we have such a proactive Secretary of State at the moment who seems to be determined to carry out an absolutely interminable schedule of international visits and activities. And I, for one, have enough faith in diplomacy and the involvement of a secretary in this kind of activity to hope and really expect that this is going to produce some positive results on the many different issues he's working on, but including, and he met just last night with Sergey Lavrov, the foreign minister, in Paris, including a significant improvement in U.S.-Russian relations. And I think lastly, one point I'd make on the question of U.S.-Russian relations, we have to decide what we want. Do we want, we Americans, do we want to be sitting on the sidelines and offering our commentary, sometimes gratuitous, if you don't mind me saying, on what's happening internally in Russia as far as their human rights and other situations are concerned? Sure, people have a right to be concerned and interested in those things, but they should not be linked to our ability to cooperate on other extremely important issues. U.S.-Russia relations. Russia is vital to our common objective of achieving a solution in Syria and solving the non-proliferation issues in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and in Iran. And I think we've got to, as Americans, keep our focus on those critical interests as we contemplate, and terrorism, of course, as we contemplate the United States-Russia relationship.
Well, let's thank our panelists for their opening remarks. And I'll start off with this question for all three of you. So before the Boston, and without trying to incriminate any of you, because it is a topic of public debate, but because it is, I think it'll be, be more chum in the water. So we got, the United States, we got a message from Russia to our FBI to watch out for these guys, or one of these guys at least. The ambassador is saying we need better coordination. The general is saying we need to watch out for civil liberties kind of concerns. You're saying, Ambassador Negroponte, that this is an important relationship. Did we handle this message from Russia in the right way? What could we have done better without second guessing? Or how should we approach a situation like that?
Well, I'll start quickly. If you can take just about any significant incident that has occurred and then study it retrospectively, and you come to the brilliant conclusion that hindsight is 20/20 vision, and you end up connecting dots that just weren't that obvious to people as you were living through the events. So I'd rather than speculating about how we could have done it differently, I just would say, how can we improve the cooperation going forward? Because almost any of these events, you see that you make these connections retrospectively and not while you're living through them.
Ambassador or General?
Well, I'm not a specialist in intelligence or law enforcement, but I would say that first, I fully agree that cooperation needs to be expanded and improved. Secondly, we also need to overcome maybe kind of inertia of the past in our relations and the relations between the law enforcement as well. We need to better understand that we are in the same boat and to focus on that. And that would certainly require a lot of work to increase trust between our two countries, including by the specialists who deal on such sensitive issues. I'm glad to see that it is exactly what is happening now. It's certainly painful that it took so much time and so much trouble to do so. But I fully agree with John that what is important that after Boston, instead of making empty accusations and we wouldn't take any, because we've done what we could at the time. But I would say that the focus of efforts by two governments is to understand how we can cooperate on this particular case, and we do cooperate. And also what we can do in the future in order to make us capable of reinforcing each other. And I would underline, reinforcing each other in our respective fight against the terrorists.
Great, thank you. Ambassador?
I'll just add very briefly. Number one, there may not have been anything possible between the Russian and American services that would have prevented this. So we have to understand that. Now that said, since my old agency was one of the ones who got a note from the FSB, this was almost certainly done at a level I would call transactional. It was a note. And then this bureaucracy took the handoff from that bureaucracy, turned the crank, and did what bureaucracies do. We do not have an intimate counterterrorism relationship with the Russian services. So if you can picture this going on with some other country, just let your imaginations work here, with whom we have closer ties or deeper history of intelligence cooperation, the note would have been accompanied by conversation. The note would have been accompanied by informal discussion. But again, this is very much at the transactional level. So I guess I'm just reinforcing what the two ambassadors said. What happened happened because of the structure of the relationship. Perhaps if you make the relationship a bit more personal, a bit more interactive, when you're cooperating not at the level of final product, which is what this was, final intelligence product, but down here in the realm of intelligence questions rather than answers, it may have led to more. But let me end where I began. This may not have been the case in this instance.
Thank you. So we'll take some questions now. Jill Doherty, would you like to give us a question?
Well, you know, when I wasn't actually thinking of a question, but since you called on me, one of the factors that came up, and Mr. Hayden referred to this, in the United States, it is said that when they were dealing with the Russians, there was a reluctance to take at face value what the Russians were saying about people like Tsarnaev, or specifically Tsarnaev, because there is a concern that the Russian services do not respect, let's say, the formal rules and regulations dealing with human rights and civil rights of people. So therefore, the Americans might think that the Russians wanted to go after Tsarnaev because he was politically working with terrorists rather than a strictly, let's say, terrorist act. I'm not explaining this precisely, but I think there seems to be concern, at least on the American side, that the respect for civil rights and protections that are built into the American system do not exist in the Russian system. Maybe this is in the weeds too much, but do you feel that this is one of the core problems in impeding cooperation between the two services?
Well, should I start, John?
Good.
Yeah,
General?
okay. I'll take a quick cut at it. That may have been a flavoring over top of all this, but I don't think it was at its core. All right? I think there's a reluctance. Number one, the transactional nature of the relationship makes it harder. But beyond that, the lens through which an American intelligence officer would have looked at this information, I don't think would have been strongly colored by human rights, because that may or may not be an issue, but it doesn't color this kind of report. It would have been something along the lines of, the Russians are mad at a lot of Chechens. Not all of them are terrorists, and I don't know very many who are threats to the United States. And so it would not have been Russian human rights. It would have been the fact that this was a complicated situation in Russia and in the post-Soviet space, and that terrorism was only one threat. You know, even today, when you look at Tsarnaev's motivation, you know, was it Chechen irredentism, global jihadism, or alienated youth? And the answer is yes.
Well, Joe, I'm not sure that I know what American specialists in intelligence were thinking about Russia. And to be honest, I'm not even interested in it. I see what is happening. And that's exactly what I call inertia of the past. That we need to overcome a philosophy where the terrorist, in the eyes of another country, might be political tool in yours. Terrorists are terrorists everywhere. And if we do communicate whatever we have known about the intents and the thinking, we communicate it because we want you to protect yourself and help us to protect ourselves against people of concern. That is kind of philosophy in these actions. And that kind of cooperation needs certainly to be expanded. When it comes to the notion of Russian human rights, it's the third time I hear it around this table. I wasn't planning to give a battle on this issue, but I will, because it's unfair. Human rights in Russia are pretty fine. They are within the constitution of Russian Federation. And we are very much proud of what we have accomplished during only 20-something years of the existence of Russia in this current state. And what some label here, quote unquote, Russian human rights, is a subject of the perceptions that are also being carried over from the past. That is something I feel, I see, and we have discussed it with you as well. When you open the newspapers here, the only things about Russia are only negative. And they are all picked up in Russian press, if not all, 80% picked up in Russian press. But the rest of the stories that are about what is good in Russia are never published here. And so there is a kind of telescopic vision of what is happening in Russia, but what is also important, that the Russian press, and talking to Russian press, I would underline it once again, also look at what is not happening in Russia and what positive is happening in Russia. That would certainly give your readers much, and televiewers, much better perspective of what Russia is. So the issue of human rights has nothing to do in Russia with the terrorists. The terrorists that operate in Russia have their own agenda. And it's not about human rights or fight against human rights abuses or anything else. The kind of people that we are facing now are basically the fundamentalists and who want to expand their own view of what the religion should look like. They are killing Russians and Muslim brothers as well if they do not feel that they share their views. And it's something that it's not exceptional or exclusive only to Russia. We see it happening in many other countries. So terrorism is terrorism. It's terrorism anywhere. Terrorism doesn't have a nationality, in my view. It doesn't have a justification, whatever the actions they take. And we need to work in order to deny them a chance. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question for the three panelists. What would you say the Boston bombings did to the dynamics of the relationship between the United States and Russia, specifically over Syria? And I have one specifically for the Russian ambassador. I'm an Arab, but obviously I also live in the United States. I mean, both in the Arab world and in the United States. And I hear a lot of people express their frustration to actually understand the position of the Russian government vis-a-vis Syria. They say almost 100,000 people have been killed. The country has been destroyed. And yet the overarching message they get from the Russian position is that it's still willing to stick, if not with Bashar al-Assad, certainly with his regime through thick and thin. Why is Syria so important to your government?
First of all, we got together to discuss Boston and not Syria, but I will answer anyway. What is the impact of Boston events on our ability to cooperate on Syria? I don't know. Those are separate issues. And after Boston, we see more discussions, more, hopefully, plans, proactive willingness of work together among the law enforcement, and we welcome this. It's long overdue. When it comes to our position on Syria, we do not stick to a particular person. We stick to the Syrian people being able to decide what is their future. Because the country is divided almost in two. And here people are talking mainly about the people on the side on opposition, and some already recognize them as legitimate representatives of Syrian people. But there is another half of the country, you know it as we do, and they are also Syrians. And they also have a right to participate in decision making as to who is going to be their leader, what country they want to live in. And after these very painful years of war, that is certainly a huge tragedy for the Syrian people, they need to be able to decide, all of them, those on the opposition side and those who are still supporting the government, and as you call it, stick to the government. They need to sit together and to decide what the future of their country is going to be. Because any other recipe, it's a recipe for disaster, for the bloodshed, for the revenge, an absence of peace in this region. Why is Syria important? It's important not only to us, it's important to everybody who thinks about the future of the whole region. And if that kind of situation is permitted to continue, we will see more bloodshed, most probably spilling over to other countries. And unlike the United States, we live next by. And we certainly feel the threat much to the stability in this region in much more acute fashion than some analysts here. So what we are trying to do, and we are glad that the Secretary of State and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia are working now together, irrespective of a lot of differences on particular aspects of the situation in Syria. They are working together in order to reach the main goal, to bring all the Syrians to the table, to make them to decide what's going to be their future. Whether they want a particular leader or not has to be decided by them. Any other recipe is a recipe for continued disaster. Thank you.
Maybe if I could add a point here. First of all, I think sometimes it's frustrating for Americans to think, well, gee, we can't solve this by ourselves. I mean, we'd rather just be able to just take the solution into our own hands. Remember, the unilateralist basically preemptive solutions that we used in Iraq. We had a coalition of the willing, but we couldn't get a Security Council. You were there for our long debates at the Security Council, and it was frustrating for us, but I think there was perhaps a certain degree of wisdom on the part of the countries that withheld their support for the second resolution, because getting rid of the existing government was only the beginning of a long road. And I think that's really the lesson from Iraq, if you will. Deposing Mr. Bashar al-Assad is just the entrance ticket to the huge problems that are going to follow thereafter. And our country's record and the world's record in the area of regime change and nation building is not exactly littered with great successes. So I think we're right to be very, very cautious about what to do next about Syria. We're all also right to deplore what's happening there, but I'm pleased that I'm glad that we're consulting with Russia. I think we've got to do more work inside the Security Council. We've got to do it with China and Russia and try to reach some real meeting of the minds as to how to go about resolving this, because if we can reach agreement together with China, the UK, and France, the P5, then I think the way forward for the international community is going to be a lot easier than if we adopt some kind of unilateralist and preemptive approach.
So what is your impact, your assessment of Ambassador Negroponte on Boston, whether it did do anything or not?
No, I think, I think it's good that there wasn't a negative reaction towards, as I said earlier, the relationship with Russia on the part of the United States and the American people. But I think what's driving the greater cooperation on Syria at the moment is the dynamic inside of Syria itself and the urgency of the Syrian situation in the context of the greater Middle East.
Ambassador Sagar.
Thank you, Kathy. General Hayden, from your analysis, I draw the conclusion that there's probably very little that anybody can do to change the motivation for terrorist acts. There's probably very little anybody can do to take away the means to build IEDs. But it's maybe perhaps the only thing that we can try to do is take away or prevent them from achieving their goal, which is to terrorize. If we just refuse to be terrorized, you alluded a little bit to that, the British reaction. And of course, I'm not suggesting that we ignore these kind of things for no other reason than out of respect for the victims and their families. But is there anything that governments can do? Is there anything the media can do in terms of response to try to prevent them to achieve the goals? Since we can't prevent them from accidents, then we can change the motivation.
Sir, Mr. Ambassador, a couple of thoughts. I sounded pretty dark about Boston and a certain sense of inevitability. We may discover that this Boston was preventable, but what I'm trying to share with you is the consensus of my old community that a Boston is inevitable. That's going to happen just because of the nature of the lower level of threat and the choices we'll make as to how much we will want to do to defend ourselves.
Could I ask something? But General, weren't you saying two things? Are you saying that Boston is inevitable because we're unwilling across the country to put in place the measures New York City has? Is that what I'm inferring?
No, I don't. That's why I said New York was kind of a countercultural part of my opening remarks.
You said it wouldn't have happened in New York.
It would not have.
But so is it logical to assume that if we all put in place New York provisions, protocols, it
right?
wouldn't happen?
And would we? And New York is a special case, almost an international city. 1/3 of the population is born outside of the country. Almost that much of the population has English as a second language. And so one can almost see why that would be possible in the circumstances and with the resources of New York. But done universally, certainly done at the federal level, I think would be very, very frightening to all of us.
So essentially you're saying to get that marginal benefit, an economist would say, to get that marginal benefit in terms of fewer incidents, the cost, particularly in terms of privacy and civil liberty, is just prohibitive.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, Mr. Ambassador, to follow on to your question, we have it, and so, again, I'm being dark here, but I'm trying to be realistic. These kinds of things, sooner or later, I use the phrase, and I think the ambassador here will recognize it. This is penalty kicks in soccer, all right? No matter how good our goalie is, sooner or later, this ball is going to end up in the back of the net. But we have it within our ability to turn a tactical success by our enemy into a strategic defeat for us by the way we respond to the enemy's marginal success. And so I think you suggested this in your comments. There's a certain amount of our ability to deny the effects of terrorism by refusing to be terrorized. The final point I'd make is this entire discussion, the big attack, the little attack, what we can do at the airports, what we can't do, what we do with FSB and so on, is intensely about what we in the military would call the near fight. That's dealing with the person who's already convinced he wants to kill you and your family. We won't win this war at the near fight. It can only be won at the deep fight. And that's about the production rate of those people in 1, 3, or 5 years' time are going to be convinced that they want to kill you and your family. And that is a longer, deeper, almost ideological issue that requires a whole of government rather than a security service response.
Let's take one more question. Chris, did you have one question? No. Oh, David, thank you.
Just to turn this a little bit back to the cancer analogy and how the doctors fight cancer by bringing up a new drug to try to hold back that, and the drugs get more and more powerful. You all are professionals. You're all in a role that, if you would, you're civil servants. You've served your country, but we're worried that eventually the tools you've developed are going to be misused. And because of the recent story about the AP and other things, I just want to ask you, do you ever question yourselves about the idea of the fight that you've started and how it might get out of control in terms of the government being abusive of human rights, civil rights, and again, I'm not talking about Russia. I'm talking just about the.
Thank you.
Walter Pincus has a very good piece in the Washington Post about that today. Yeah, Mike? He had to struggle with this back.
Yeah, I'm the only one at the table who actually had to run 2 controversial programs, the terrorist surveillance program at NSA and renditions, detentions, and interrogations at CIA. And, you can probably tell from my tone, I'm pretty comfortable. All right, I think we played within the lines, but as I often say, we had chalk dust on our cleats from the foul lines. We took it all the way to the edge. And the belief that you go all the way out to the edge, if you don't go out to the edge, what you're doing is defending yourself or your agency, and you're not defending the republic. All right? And so when the circumstances warranted, and certainly 02, 03, 04 warranted it, in 06, we pulled back the detention and interrogation program because circumstances had changed. Okay? And so there's always that danger. You have to be sensitive to the external environment. What's appropriate at one time may not be appropriate at another time, not because our laws changed, but because of the external environment having changed. And so back to the ambassador's comment about Walter Pincus's story this morning in the Washington Post. I mean, Walter's pushing back. Walter is suggesting the great difficulty in people responsible for the Republic's freedom, security, and people responsible for the Republic's freedom in terms of freedom of the press. That's a constant tension. And it will not go away. It will not be resolved. It is a condition to be managed, and the right place within those 2 force fields varies depending on the circumstances.
Any other comments? Okay, I think we'll wrap it up. Thank you all for coming today. Terrific panel. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you all. Our next IFE info will be June 11th at the White House. And we hope to see many of you.
Thanks, Mayor. Nice to see you, Tony.